to make it overly graphic, but I just wanted to trigger warn that for anyone who might want to hear it. And also, I would prefer my POIs to be verbal, so if you could just unmute and interrupt, that would be best. The odds that I see your POI in the chat or on the screen are very, very low. Okay.
Quickly, but I know you guys were having Wi-Fi issues earlier. Are you okay at present? Would you prefer if we turn cameras off? Okay, if you're not sure, I'm going to leave mine off just to be safe.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. In India, it used to be legal to burn a widow at the stake after their husband died. We think that this might have been morally acceptable and in fact morally good for the wife to die with her deceased husband. But when the British government stepped in and said, yes, we recognize that we are not your sovereign rulers, but we don't think this should be legal. We are going to step in and make it illegal anyways. We think that was the excellent decision and the moral imperative for the British government. Two main arguments coming out of PM. Firstly, why we alleviate suffering, and secondly, weighing this against any principal considerations of consent of those people. Firstly, then on the idea of alleviating suffering, because we think that even if you can morally accept pain to be good, that pain is still felt. It is felt as physical pain if you're a woman and you are being forced into, for example, if you're more likely to be, for example, sexually harassed. We think that just because you accept it as morally okay simply means that you might think that you deserve that suffering or that is the natural state for you to suffer. It does not mean that you don't still physically feel that suffering anyway and physically feel demeaned and humiliated. But secondly, we think a lot of people are not going to accept it on a moral basis. As the info side states, we think this is a government that is extremely repressive, presumably is repressing some sort of dissent. We think there is going to be a significant number of the population that is going to want to fight against this. We think there is a natural inclination for people to want to gravitate towards freedom and want to gravitate towards universal morality. Why is this the case? Firstly, we think that universal morality does exist to some extent. Not everything is universally agreed upon, but basic ideas of fairness do exist. That you can take a child and the child will understand that when they're being mistreated, they will say, that's not fair. This is something that occurs across cultures. This is something that doesn't need to inherently be taught to them. They gravitate towards this idea from the very beginning. It is also why you almost get no cultures that say that it is acceptable to kill in any instance, because we all understand that something just feels really, really wrong about imposing that type of pain and suffering on someone else, and we all respect the basic sanctity of your ability to live. On top of that, we think that people generally do resist pain to themselves. People have a natural evolutionary bias for their own self-defense and to want to minimize their own suffering. As a result, we think on their side of the house, these are the types of people who are tortured by the state, who are thrown in jail and cut out for their repression. As a result, we think that firstly, we are able to bypass that suffering from the state. But on top of that, we think given that a lot of these people are going to want to swing towards universal morality anyways, we much prefer that we don't get it through revolution, which we think is much more likely on side opposition. On their side of the house, either that revolution is going to be unsuccessful, but you're still going to get people who die and become martyrs in the process, or even if it is successful, you're going to have to get through to it on a very, very bloody battleground. We think that we would much prefer that we are able to bypass all that physical violence and suffering and simply skip to the end where people are able to have their rights guaranteed. We think that this pill is likely going to be effective, considering that it's going to affect the elites and the masses equally. So the elites at the top of the government, who would be the people imposing that repressive regime onto those people, would have their minds change. As a result, we don't think there are many reasons why we don't think this would be successful. When you have a democracy, you are able to give these people the right to vote. When women have their rights instated as equal to men, they're able to protect themselves. And when you have, like, for example, Swedish socialism, you're able to guarantee people a basic safety net to minimize the amount of objective suffering that occurs. We think when we have the ability to guarantee this for so many people, we have a moral obligation to alleviate the amount of suffering that exists in the world. Before getting into the next argument, I'll take closing.
Yeah. Will anyone know, including the citizens of country X, that this pill is being used on them?
Not necessarily. We don't think there are many reasons why. Like, this sounds like a pretty magical pill. If you can make the magical pill, you can drop it in someone's water. Cool. Second argument then, on weighing this against any principal considerations of consent. Firstly, why do we value consent? We think a lot of times we don't value consent because it's inherently important. We value consent because we think when we violate it, it leads to a lot of practical harms. When you violate someone and, for example, sexually harass them or sexually assault them, the harm is that because they did not consent to it, that has immense psychological and emotional tolls on them. That is why we value consent, because we think that people in general are able to govern themselves, and therefore when they're not consenting to something, that likely means that you're causing a lot of harm on them. This is why in a lot of cases we're able to assume consent in cases where we think it's fairly obvious that your rights are being violated. For example, we would intervene internationally in cases of genocide or humanitarian intervention without requiring the express consent of those people to begin with. As a result, if our value of consent pretty much comes from practical considerations, the fact that we are able to alleviate that practical suffering basically means we wipe consent off the table. But secondly, then, let's say that consent is inherently important for whatever reason. We don't think opposition has it either. Why is this the case? Because on their side of the house, they have a system with no political and no civil liberties. Without that sense of freedom of speech, we think your ability to resist the government and criticize any existing social norms, the norms that you were born into without consenting into that and were likely indoctrinated into you from the very beginning, you were never able to fight against it. We think that, yes, okay, fine. Our system of morality in Sweden is not necessarily infallible, but similarly, their system of morality is not inherently infallible as well. Therefore, assuming that everyone has some capacity to make mistakes, the only reason we are able to trust our judgment is saying that even if we do make mistakes, we're able to opt and we're able to sort of swing towards making corrections and changing our minds. On their side of the house, a system that never lets you speak out against the state, never lets you challenge their ideas and therefore have a vote in a democracy or say that, for example, the state shouldn't be run by a military dictatorship or shouldn't be run as a religious state, is not able to be heard. Without ever being able to consider an opposing thought, when that is not present in your democracy, when that is not present in the media, we don't think you've actually consented into it because you've never considered any other option. You consented into it by default of being born into it. We don't think that that is true consent. We think on our side of the house, even if these people decide to have a democracy and vote in policies that we wouldn't agree with, does not matter because at the very least, they were able to have that civil discussion. They were able to have a free press. So even if we disagree with the policies that they get, at the very least, they have a system that is able to correct for it. And if this is a balance that they found, then that is a balance that we are much more able to respect because that is a case where we think it has come with consent. On their side of the house, they have to concede that these people are suffering and secondly, haven't consented to that suffering either. But lastly then, fine. Let's say that both sides are equally morally ambiguous, right? Let's weigh this against the harms that we have because we think on their side of the house, let's say that we are right, that our system of morality is correct, that it is wrong to treat women as less valuable as men and treat them as, for example, stepping stones for other men to use. If we are right, we are able to liberate all of those women, we are able to free political dissidents, we are able to stop a massive amount of harm and suffering that occurs to thousands and millions of people and children from the beginning. That is a massive benefit. For us to not act on that if we are right means that we are letting massive amounts of suffering occur. Let's say, though, we are wrong. Those people had it right. It was wrong for us to impose our system of morality on them. But there's no real harm there. We don't think that by removing their consent, there has been any similar level of practical harm that occurs to those people. So we think if we're going to do that way up and say, hypothetically, it's 50-50 likely for us both to be right, considering the harm of not following on this moral intuition is so much more important than the harm of not following on this one, we think we have a moral obligation to step in. We think on their side of the house, for them to sit by and watch millions die and burn is as simple as putting the gun to the heads themselves. We think you have a basic responsibility to care for your fellow human citizens.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the Leader of the Opposition to begin the case for the opposition bench. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech. And firstly, I'd say that the the streaming can resume now. And I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for open government.
Please P1 me by turning on your video and waving. I'll take CO. I feel a little guilty for being OG because I think that this is such a slam dunk. I think that the country that is the most affected is obviously country X. This debate is about doing what is best for the citizens of this country X and doing what is morally just for them. The reason why we must implement this is because in the status quo, basic needs are being violated and the majority of people in this country are suffering. We're able to fix this in a unique way that O gives no response to. This outweighs all other moral considerations in the round. For example, consent, for example, objective morality, for example, identity formation. Before that, let me just do some defense, terminalization, and weighing to explain when we take the one. So first, on refutation, we get three responses from OO. The first is we're told that it is fine because this will be fine in the long term because resistance is inherent in these people and it will become better. The first thing is they give the idea of this, but I think that the likelihood of success is highly unlikely because the infidel side suggests this is a very, very dominant military dictatorship. In addition to this, there are not only no political liberties, but also no civil liberties. For example, no ability to do freedom of speech, so on and so forth, to organize, which means I think this is plausibly a thought experiment. It's more extreme than any situation we're looking at in the real world, which means that maybe CO is going to do some truly phenomenal work to explain why, despite all the odds, it can succeed, but I think it's unlikely. The second thing, though, is that even if it does succeed, Jenna's own PM explains why there's a huge human cost to these kinds of sufferings. The first is the police and military industrial complex continues to persist because of financial reasons. People die against them because there's an asymmetry in the military capacity of this. Prolonged violence not only leads to the deaths and sufferings of people who are fighting back and the martyrdom of this, but prolonged suffering for everyone else around them. Because violence means that it's incredibly dangerous to conduct economic activity, which leads to things such as famine, which means that people who are relatively disenfranchised and underprivileged cannot access basic things such as medicine and healthcare. But finally, the long-term instability means that even if one actor is able to overthrow another, it is highly unlikely that this person is likely to be another high-ranking military official who has the resources to drum up support, to fund guns, to fund airships, and therefore I think what you get is an endless cycle of violence. I think we should look to countries who were affected by the Arab Spring, for example, where even though we were able to depose one leader in the best case scenario, it only has made the country suffer because infrastructure was destroyed and it created a continuous loop of suffering. The reason why this pill is so freaking great is because we bypass all of those difficult power struggles and everyone in the country, not only people who are on the ground who are already suffering, but also those in positions of power realize that what we would prefer to do is implement a new society in which we care about civil liberties, in which we want to trial people justly, in which we want to acknowledge that your identities have changed, and that therefore it is probably not necessary to go into circles of retribution, and indeed to create the groundwork for a de-society from the ground up. Why then is it that we actually create a better thing? Because I think Marta puts some reasonable things about how this world doesn't necessarily end up being perfect, right? Because resources might not be all there, or this country might have poor military resources. I think that there are two things here. The first, the most important thing is, I don't think that by any means the social democratic system is the best way of government in the world that is possible to create a human society. But I do think that it's substantially better than what we have in the info side because of two things. The first is it removes the structures of violence that are self-perpetuating, for example, misogyny, for example, violence on the status quo in the info slide. But two, because that maximizes choice and recognizes a baseline standard of human rights, such as ability to provide for your basic needs, food, shelter, freedom of speech, which means that I think that even if there are imperfections and difficulties, that the vast majority of people will be substantially better off. Okay, then let's engage with their material. Okay, why does this win the round? A couple of things. The first is, I think that we proved why the suffering in the status quo is an objective moral harm that is independent of all other things and why basic human suffering is the most important issue. And I think we proved to you why the transition to a system of social democracy is the best possible and preferable to the alternatives. I think that alleviates the suffering of thousands of people. I think that's very desirable.
Second thing then, let me just destroy the information about identity formation. 4 responses. The first is, you're not entitled to form your own identity perfectly. We don't do this in the status quo. Things are outside of our control. Some things are within our control, yes, but I think that this suggests that identity formation is not an absolute right in the same way that being hurt is not being hurt is an absolute moral right, but moreover, that what we want is to do things such as, but moreover, that these natural rights are, but moreover, that this is all on a spectrum, right? I think on a similar level, this motion is not about erasing our identities and recreating these people, but rather changing aspects of their identity. So yes, you lose control to define yourself in terms of religion, in terms of society, in terms of politics, but you retain your connections to one another. You can retain your interests. All of these things are incredibly desirable. And I think that's really, really fantastic because that fits right in with their own metric of identity formation is on a scale. But the second main response I would have is that I really do think that the status quo of suffering is more prohibitive towards the formation of identity than theirs is. The reason for this is because to the same extent, you are given norms that you must obey. The difference, though, is that I think ours is substantially more likely to lead to self-hatred, dissatisfaction, and unhappiness. The reason for this is because it is based upon a premise of inequality, where women, for example, half the population are perceived as inferior to men, wherein they're inclined to escape themselves, gaslight themselves, and be incredibly traumatized and unhappy. I think that the time frame over which this change happens is less important than the feelings and the happiness of the people who are felt, which suggests that I think our mechanism is preferable. 4-6, anything from CO?
Yeah, don't you think that the way in which you form interpersonal connections and therefore your like mitigation against identity formation is still framed within things like your religiosity and the way you conceptualize it?
I agree. Everything, but I don't think that it is formed within your religiosity. I think everything is equally interrelated because these are all things, concepts, norms that humans have created to rationalize the world around them. What is the tipping point? And here's where I'm going to weigh Jenna's material on the basic human rights being violated as the most important issue in the round. Making sure that everyone has basic rights. For example, the right not to get harassed, not to get violated, the right to eat, the right to consider yourself equal to other people, the right to healthcare, and the right to be free from violence is the defining factor. The reason for this is because these things make it biologically impossible for you to form your own identity. Because by definition, being walking, talking flesh bags, pain over all other sensations, and the Maslow's hierarchy of needs means that we have no other choice but to alleviate these pressures before anything else. So I think given those, fine, we might have to compromise some low-tier mental, emotional effects, but I think the most important issue is to make sure that the bodies are hale, hearty, whole, and that is a basic premise for our existence as happy human beings and our long-term happiness as well. Very happy to be on happy pills.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine
confirm that I'm audible?
You are, yeah.
Give me a second, set up my timer. I will start in 3, 2, 1. Before some extensions, I want to do a bunch of framing right off the bat. First of all, it's unclear what in this motion presumes that you take anything away from these people in terms of their religion, their tradition, or their history. They presumably still retain the same knowledge as their prior knowledge is not erased. This is plus sum, not zero sum, which makes it incredibly likely that on our side of the house, the new system that's going to be crafted is a system which accommodates the culture and the identity, i.e. the cultural manifestations of the system, the identity building through the school system. The flag and the anthem are likely to still be based on the tradition and on what these people believe is their history and what they hold worth and cherish, which is why social democracies also have national identities. If the cultural pull is so strong as opening opposition would want you to claim, the benefit we get on our side of the house is people just being aware of another type of regime, which is probably likely to accommodate this anyway. But secondly, we say that the increase of knowledge is a benefit in and of itself. Note that opening opposition cannot claim in any way, because there is no way to measure the objective value of political systems, that one political system is more legitimate than the other. Therefore, the only thing they can base legitimacy on is consent. But there is no way for opening opposition to assume consent, nor did opening opposition make analysis to why they think this is consensual. Maybe we can assume the consent of the first generation that established the system, i.e. the first people who did the Russian Revolution consented into that. We cannot assume the consent of future generations insofar as they were born into the system priorly. And even if they were to give you positive verbal consent, as long as oppression exists, there is no epistemic way for you to actually access their true preferences, which means no way to assume consent. If you cannot measure between political systems, then the knowledge of individuals to craft a political system and the capacity to recraft it if they are unhappy with it is the only value to which we can defer. Because if we cannot assume the objective value of different political systems, the ability of individuals to follow their own conception of the political system we think is a value in and of itself. But secondly, in terms of consent, we say that forces of religion are far stronger in terms of denying people consent than anything opening opposition talks about. Because the way in which religion works, and is likely the way in which this system perpetuates its dominance, as is said by the infant slide, is by instrumentalizing a system of eternal reward and punishment, i.e. every single action that you undertake, but not just your actions, also your thoughts, are something which factors into the eternal life of your soul, i.e. the absolute impact in terms of benefits and harms. Within a hierarchical oppressive system, the individuals who have the most power get to instrumentalize their positions as interpreters of scripture. The instrumentalized situation, there is always an asymmetry of information as to what God wants. We know that God wants us to follow the path of God, and we know the path, not necessarily the mechanisms as to how the path is supposed to be followed and how do we adapt the path to contemporary times, which means that individuals who run religious institutions can claim that a certain type of political system, a certain type of action is conducive to the eternal salvation or damnation of the soul. The consequence of this is that every action undertaken by individuals on the opposition side of the house is necessarily coerced, because a reward and punishment system exists prior to them undertaking that action, and this reward and punishment system is unavoidable insofar as God is claimed to be omniscient and his words are put in the mouths of those who have power, and is also an absolute system, i.e. the harms are unimaginable if you get on the wrong side of it, which means that on their side of the house, consent does not exist. And what is the comparative? I think opening opposition misses what social democracy is. Social democracy is primarily an economic ideology. Social democracy claims that there needs to be an element of redistribution, that there needs to be a welfare state and a safety net. It does not pass judgment on identities. One of the fundamental premises of social democracy is the plurality of identities, the plurality of conceptions of the good, and the ability of individuals to speak out and accept different identities, which is why in social democracies like Sweden, we have things like pride manifestations, but we also have right-wing protests allowed, even if the majority doesn't agree with them. The prerequisite, however, for you to be able to form your identity is to have the material conditions to do so, because being able to practice your identity very often requires certain types of behavior, very often requires certain types of dress, very often requires you to access some kind of material goods. Insofar as social democracy is a redistributive system, we say it allows more people to access their identity, and we win on the opening opposition's metric. But lastly, if opening opposition supports revolution as an alternative, there's two implications of that. First of all, there's no absolute consent to any revolution. So Marta says, oh, but we know that people are asking for us to come in. Not all people are asking. At what point do you draw the line? How many people need to ask for this to be legitimate? If the opening opposition cannot define this, this means that they fundamentally stand for the same principle as we do. Because when Marta says we need to come in when people are asking us, you are passing a moral judgment. You can also ignore them asking you. The reason why you think we should listen to them and not ignore them is because you believe that regardless of what they do after we leave, we first need to give them the chance to choose. So in supporting that as an alternative, Marta is supporting our case. No, closing opposition cannot knife this, but also revolution as an alternative is just worse because it creates instability, destroys infrastructure, funnels money from the country. Insofar as op stands for the same outcome, but simply creates a country which is less able to recover, we think we just win on the comparative. Before providing you 2 more points, I'm willing to take opening opposition. Cool, closing will have a speech. 1, we think the system is illegitimate because it creates a system of narratives which discounts moral actors a priori. Women, but also dissidents, I presume, and different minorities, are portrayed as inhuman or at least submissive, i.e. construct systems of meaning that a priori assume that some human beings have a lower inherent value. First of all, we claim this is epistemically unjust, insofar as it's objectively impossible to measure the worth of one moral actor against another, but controversially, even if there were objectively more valuable moral actors, human beings do not have access to that objective metric, because every attempt to choose a metric to measure between 2 human beings is also necessarily subjective, insofar as it derives from our own experiences and our own desires, which are not universal to humankind. This means that this regime is necessarily illegitimate, insofar as it passes a judgment, it has no information to pass it on, and therefore illegitimately discounts certain individuals as moral actors. But secondly, not that knowingly continuing to persist in this action is immoral, because even if you're able to convince a person that they are submissive, we think the intent is problematic. The intent to have this person not able to have a conception of free will means that necessarily the actions committed by the state are immoral insofar as they hold someone in submission. This is why intuitively we think gaslighting is horrible, because even though abusers are able to convince the abused that they are guilty, we still think they should fucking rot in hell. But secondly, we think to some extent this is an actor motion, i.e. we are someone who would give the pill to these individuals. We need to evaluate the legitimacy of our act from the position of an actor, therefore. There are 2 levels here. First of all, we need to try to judge this act based on the information the actor has. The actor has no information about consent. The actor can assume that consent to getting this pill may not be given, but as far as the actor knows, the thing they perceive most proximately is oppression. Given that there is low harm for the actor, and the actor perceives oppression more proximately than they do a potential lack of consent, given the information that the actor has, it is more moral to act by giving the pill, because it's more likely that it produces positive utility insofar as obligations towards other individuals exist. Even if one person is harmed on their side of the house, this means that you as an actor are complicit in this. For all those reasons, closing government.
I thank the member of government for that fine speech, and I'd like to invite the member of opposition to extend the case to the opposition bench.
Oh, sorry, just give me 30 seconds. I'm going to run really quickly to the washroom. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yep.
All right, cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to say a couple of things in CO in terms of claims, and then you can choose whether you buy them or not. But before that, I think I want to make a few observations that are a bit weird in the government side. Note that their end point in this debate that they claim is so great is the notion of agency and preferences in a social democracy. CJ tries to claim that this is at best an economic model that prioritizes your capacity to access material goods. But note that it still requires you to care about agency, to the extent to which some people believe that unfettered capitalism is correct because they have more of an economic right to the free market and to accumulate capital. than, you know, any other right that ought to be important. Like, for example, a person's capacity to like not be homeless, for instance. So I think it still rests upon the aggregation of preferences among a large group of people. If that is true, and if they do care about agency, and they also accept that within democracies, you still have to create a priority in terms of values based on individual subjective conceptions of what is correct or wrong, then presumably on their side, they care the most about whether people can actually make decisions that are free and unfettered in a way that best prioritizes their own interests. So ultimately, I think this debate is a comparative of agency with regards to whether or not we believe that an intravenous sort of changing of the way that you think in this world versus, like, say, perhaps some sort of we accept the trade-off of like less agency under a system of an oppressive regime is necessarily going to be worse. And I think that is the frame through which we want to debate this particular motion. But the second thing that I want to note here is that to the extent to which, obviously in debating, we tend to draw arbitrary distinctions between what we consider to be okay exercises of agency and parts at which we don't think there is an exercise of agency that's legitimate, like, say, for example, physical violence. The truth is, government bench has not actually articulated to you a single reason as to why exactly they're likely to stand or what their standard is for an objective moral good that they're willing to stand for that is apart from agency that justifies this particular intervention. The only person and the only people, I think, that has articulated anything resembling this is the OG, which claims that physical pain ought to be the point at which we prevent these things from happening. So that's where I'm going to start on my extensions. First question, what does it mean to be happy? And I think that here is where false consciousness becomes really important, because I think the first thing to note is that if this is true, and this is a hugely religious part of that society, and we recognize that in all societies, including social democracies, we need to create a hierarchy and prioritization of interest anyway, then we ought to also believe that precisely because of not necessarily an instrumentalization of heaven and hell, that could well be true, but also because of people buying into the idea that they want to sacrifice for their God, for instance, it is possible that individuals are actually completely and truthfully brainwashed into this particular ideal, such that what we conceive of as oppression from an external lens, of which, again, you have no epistemic access to their preferences for, right, which means it's symmetric, is not necessarily oppression by their own metrics. But secondly, I would argue religion is actually quite important. Religion can arguably be seen to be the foundation of humanity, in that it's a manifestation of the idea of a soul, something that separates us apart from just the physical lives that we are living. So I think because of that, we ought to conceive of what people care about, and we cannot just intervene in the way that they make these determinations for themselves. But secondly, I also think that physical pain is an insufficient criteria, because people oftentimes make personal considerations as to how they want to prioritize things like physical pain as only one of many other things that they care about. So for instance, self-mutilation on the part of like religious individuals, people who enter into sports and dedicate their lives, broken knees, broken legs, all of these other things, a lifetime of aches and pains, for example, are all individuals who have chosen to deprioritize the notion of subjective physical suffering in exchange for what is a higher, perhaps arbitrary, but still to them fundamentally subjectively important preference and good that they would like to support instead. Before I move on, yes, OG.
Our case is about alleviating universal physical suffering. We explain why this also happens to take the up yardsticks of identity and choice, but suffering and basic needs are always more important because they dominate your being, dehumanize you, and makes life no longer worth living.
No, but I just explained why is it that sometimes the idea that it dehumanizes your being is actually a conception that people can negotiate with. The rest I will cover in the rest of my extension. The second thing then is I want to make a distinction as to why this particular form of indoctrination is significantly worse than the indoctrination that is externally imposed. The one thing that we must note here is that the reason why agency is important is because to the extent to which you can't access the preferences of people, you can't guarantee utile outcomes even in a social democracy. The only thing that we can genuinely value in society today is the notion of whether or not people actually have the capacity to be able to act. And here's the difference. The difference is it is obviously true that things like religion, things like your family, things like your knowledge, for example, are all things that determine to some extent who you are and what your identity is like. But I think that the word that we really must zero in here in the info slide is the notion of will, which is to say that this artificially imposes a will upon you in a way that you cannot negotiate with. It's that intravenous and like it is basically an assault and fundamental assault on your mind and who you are, right? So why is it that it's not just additive? I think that there is a moral problem with that assault on agency in and of itself. And the reason for that is because every other externally imposed form of indoctrination still has to go through the prism of your own agency and consciousness. You still can make your own capacity to rebel against what other people are telling you. You can still form your own thoughts about these things as well. The problem with this pill is that it quite concretely removes your capacity to ever be able to make those kinds of rebellions, those kinds of fights against what other people are telling you is the good, especially one that we generally think is good because we are like, Western educated and the like, but does not actually make any sort of intimations as to what individuals might necessarily want. So on the CG side particularly, they would tell a woman, for example, who wants to wear the hijab that she ought not do so because there is something that's objectively presumably bad for her, or a similar argument will apply for any other form of religious practice or cultural practice that they would otherwise want to do. Therefore, I think the conclusion of this is there is no actual reason why their life is going to be happier. And even if it is, this is still an unfair way of getting to the outcome that they want. The second thing that I want to talk about then is what is their life going to be like when it comes to this world that we're talking about? And I think that when it comes to living under repressive regimes, there's actually other political scientists that have written about this, right? Jeremy Scott, for example, writes about the moral economy. And I think this is quite crucial because it means that even within a repressive regime, individuals oftentimes find ways to create things like micro-rebellion, dragging their feet when it comes to collection of taxes, etc. Obviously, you can be somewhat repressive, but a repression needs to also be negotiated with the fact that people live their lives in a state that cannot always be looking over them. But I think what's crucial here is that even if you can't physically rebel, you can still rebel in your mind as well. And that sanctuary is still the place in which you are able to cordon off any external influence in the way that you cannot when it comes to this pill, because it enforces that will upon individuals. I think it is entirely possible that it's not just additive and therefore good for people, but rather that they feel intense fragmentation within their own identity for that matter. I think that the stripping away of the agency is problematic. And I think your ability to be able to rebel against what external conditions are imposed upon you, even within repressive regimes, is valuable in and of itself, because that act of agency is what I think is the most valuable that we ought to ensure that individuals are able to hold on to. Ultimately, if this debate cares in any way about what people want and what people want to, what people give a shit about, I think there are ways in which they can alleviate their oppression, but you also can't determine those things for them. The last thing that I want to say is in member of government, he claims that because we have another speech, they don't even take a POI. I think that is the thing I have the most problem with, because I don't think that that's what it means to have to take one POI. We're very happy to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for that fine speech, and I'd now like to invite the government whip to summarise the case for the government bench.
Sorry, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
From closing opposition, what we hear is that this motion is a terrible idea because it externally imposes a will on people. We see this is likely to be uncomparative on both sides, but that wasn't what was important, because what was important was what Tin told you on our side. That is, the will that is imposed on you is one that allows people to have free will. The will that we are imposing on people is one to create a system that values moral actors and equally. And I think this is important because it's not an ideologically colored will. That is to say, the will that we impose is not filled with a priori moral judgments. When I imbue you with a will, I'm not imbuing you with any additional preferences or you making any other moral judgments. It is purely a will that says that you should desire to live in a system that allows you and allows everyone to maximize their freedom and to engage in free will. People still get to define their identity. They still get to do all the other things that they want to say. And I think this is important because from both opposition teams, we get literally no conception of what kind of limiting will we actually impose on individuals. Tin is the only one to give you this and justify why it is okay in these instances to limit it. I want to talk about closing opposition, then OO, then opening government. But Shrimé is right. So if OO has a POI, I'll take it. Otherwise, CEO, give your first POI. Come on, guys, you gotta ask. All right, closing opposition, the team that asks us give POIs, and then, oh yeah, OO, go ahead.
So we can agree the actions of the state are immoral and there are other ways to help the people. What you need to defend is committing deep violation and assault on the agency and personality of the whole country.
One, I think any other alternative that Marta talks about in OO is something that is likely to induce the same sort of bad like autonomy violations that you have. Like opening opposition has like very charitable interpretation, which is like, you trade a little bit more or you inspire revolutions, which like for what it's worth, I think seem pretty bad. But I think the like less generous interpretations of this, so that you look to things like invasions because you justify it on the lines of helping people that are in like religious republics avoid things like genocide. I just don't think there's any analysis given to you as to why those things are not equally violated of sovereignty, if not much, much worse. 4 things to deal with closing opposition. 1, closing opposition premises that some people accept pain and are okay with it. I think the problem here is they just don't respond to the principle that Tin gives, which is that to say you have no information to suggest that these people are ever able to get it. That is to say, Op can give you reasons why people might want pain or might like pain, but insofar as strict oppression exists, even things like positive consent, positive verbal consent, can't assume to be accurate or true. Which is just to say that even if it is true, even if it is slightly possible that some people were able to accept pain and wanted to accept pain, there was quite literally no reason why you should act with that judgment in mind, rather than assuming that when people are under strict oppression, they do not like the pain that they are in. The second thing to say here is, fine, if they want to live under tyrannical systems, they can do that. The premise of the extension was actually ridiculously simple, and I want to be clear about what it was. You are giving people knowledge. You are not taking away anything. This is functionally equivalent to me being required to go to school and learn about social democracy, and me being able to make choices about that because my school teacher inspires me with a will to engage in social democracy. That's the framing that Tin gives, the framing about giving you knowledge and not taking away anything, that I think kills opposition bench, because you are not taking away anything. There is no principled harm to imputing knowledge on people. But even more, I think that you get most things better on our side of the house, because the problem that you get from closing opposition is they say that there's a moral problem with the will imposing the will. 1, I think this is untrue. That is to say, they say it's important because there's no way you can change people's will on any other side of the house. I don't know what it looks like to change someone's will, but I think that almost everything you do that changes your preferences equally affects your will. That is to say, all of Tin's arguments about why you are likely to be coerced by the political systems or by the religious systems, by the conception of damnation or eternal damnation of your soul, is exactly why you built up the will that was imputed on you by the church to do the sorts of things that they made you do. Why, if you were doctrined into something by your school, by your government, by your media, that was likely to change the will that you had. There was literally no reason that they gave why will could not be something changed in anything else, why there was some intrinsic will. And that's the premise, because closing opposition's entire extension is premised on some absurd conception of the mind and the body, where your will is just so intrinsic to you and nothing can ever shape it, and you can fight back against anything with that will. But I just do not think that there is ever a reason for why this is a distinct thing from any other part of the preferences that you impose. So this is massively uncomparative. The last thing to say here was, I think, what we already said in framing. That is to say, even if they were correct about will being extraordinarily important, the will that we gave you was not one that said that your current living system is bad. It was one that said, you now should believe that you have the freedom to maximize what you think your free will is, which I think is good, because let's say that you liked living in tyrannical systems. You were happy to push for that on your side of the house. You were happy to push for that when you gained a better understanding of what it was. But I think what this motion realistically did is it made sure that people that did not have accurate conceptions of what it was like to live in a state that wasn't this, they now gave that to them. I want to talk about opening opposition. I think there was very little that Tin did not already beat, but I want to be very clear here. 1, on alternatives, I think you just get massively worse. 2, on identity formation, even if it was not true that you did not lose your identity, which is what Tin already says, we pointed out that identity rights, according to DLO themselves, stop at the point that you are actually committing harm on anyone, which is where Tin's extension and argument about treating moral actors as equal actually applied. That is to say, you made sure that you were able to violate those conceptions of identity rights because the alternative was to treat people with harm. CO, POI.
Sorry.
Sure.
So
CO.
it seems to be entirely arbitrary when a great thinker came out of the concept of democracy and whether people around the world have access to that particular idea. Why is that somehow a reason as to how you can like violate people's agency in order to argue that they have less agency on your side of the house?
So I think this also goes into what CO says in terms of accusing us of not defining an absolute moral good. And I'd point out that I actually don't think they do that, because I don't think there's anything intrinsic about the will that isn't intrinsic about any other preference. I'd say we don't have to do this. That is to say, as impossible as a moral, absolute, universal good is something to define. The concept of social democracy is based on the idea of individuals being able to define it for themselves. And this is where Tin argues why a redistributive system is good, insofar as resources not being poor, having a safety net, are all prerequisites to safely build your identity, which is something I think we uniquely give you over opening government that takes out opening opposition. Let's say that you believe in the opposition bench version of the argument. That is to say that autonomy is more important than utility because there are things that you don't value intrinsically, but rather the conception that you get of utility is based off of human value, which I think maybe beats opening government's conception of utility claims. We're the only ones to fill the gap in that round because Tin and I point out why you aren't able to freely make value judgments right now because you're constrained from doing so. You lack the understanding, the experience, the knowledge to conceptualize a system outside of the one that you currently live in. By giving you additional knowledge, we liberate you. Incidentally, this puts us over opening government as well. I think the problem with opening government is maybe they tell you about why these things are bad a priori. Tin is the one that tells you why principally they're bad in terms of all the reasons about being complicit in these harms should you choose not to do this, plus all the reasons about not having the proper information to make those choices, so you have to opt into Gov. Here.
I thank the government whip for that fine speech, and now I'd like to invite the opposition whip to summarise the case for the opposition bench and to close out the debate.
You are muted. Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Thanks. I'll take PI in chat, please. Yeah, starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to broadly ask two questions in this debate. First, I want to ask how you're going to weigh the issue of physical harm. Second, I want to ask what about the issue of consent and agency, why I think we win on both. First, how do you weigh physical harm? The big push that you get from the OG is, broadly speaking, we stop physical harm that exists in the status quo. Physical harm is necessarily the bar by which we don't care about these other metrics. And the analogy that the way PM justifies this is an analogy to status quo, where they say that the problem is that we're in the status quo, at the point there's physical harm, we vitiate consent. The first thing I want to note is that I think that if the debate was going to be won by saying physical harm exists, like there's just no meaning in the next 7 speeches if you win the debate, because obviously there is a problem of physical harm that exists. Clearly, the CA team doesn't want that to be the way in which a team simply wins the debate. And the reason for that is because I think in justifying that physical harm is the metric, they default to a status quo analogy that argues that the status quo, the world that we live in, is one where we care significantly about physical harm and repression. The problem is that this is not then contextualized into a world where you didn't believe that physical harm or you didn't and repression was a priori the worst thing that could happen to your particular society. What Sherman explains here is that false consciousness is still, even if we claim it's false consciousness, it's still meaningful to the individuals who hold that particular consciousness, and no alternative world, even no alternative way of thought is superior to that particular way of thought to that particular individual at that point in time. They say it's unclear why you're going to assume that this is legitimate, but they also have the same problem of assuming that another consciousness which you impose on them is legitimate. Therefore, what I posit that is that insofar as that, if people perceive the kind of physical harm they are in as legitimate, and Sherman gives you numerous examples in the status quo of instances where people accept physical harm as being legitimate to them in terms of the way they want to live their lives, then the conclusion is then that physical harm cannot be the way in which we judge this debate. Insofar as opening gov frames a lot of the discussion around this issue of physical harm, I think they're out of this debate at the point that their discussion doesn't go significantly into the way in which we construct the narrative of consent. So what about the issue of consent and agency? And I want to take the rest of the debate. The first thing I want to note is that this debate cannot reasonably be about identity construction, because I do think opening government proves that given the level of argumentation you heard in the opening debate, the way in which they construct identity is not free, is more likely to be limited, and therefore probably is not a valuable outcome that stands at this point in the debate. The framing that Sherman gives you, and this is important, is to suggest that both sides ultimately are going to live under some degree of a coercive framework. And the question is then which one is less less coercive and therefore restores more degree of agency to the individual. No response came from Aditya about why agency should be the metric that we judge the round with, because all these other things, like physical outcomes, are uncertain. It is uncertain that you'll get a better physical life on that side of the house. Like if this liberal democracy goes to shit economically, it's not clear to me that on the metric of physical harm that Selker wants to use, that this is necessarily going to be a significantly better world for these individuals on that side of the house. So it's not clear to me that any like pragmatic outcome is really the debate that we want to have. Before I dive into this, shop.
I think that suffering does define more outcomes. First, because I proved that when you're in intense physical pain and unhappiness, that overrides your ability to make choices as well.
Yeah, so I genuinely, and I'm unclear why a lot of people are going to be subject to intense physical pain. You're under a repressive regime, not a regime that like cuts off everybody's limb, right? The overwhelming majority of individuals there are likely to not experience this degree of physical pain. They're likely to, the pain they're likely to have is a limited degree of agency, which is why I think your argumentation also only works on a subset of people who choose to be dissidents. And like, as much as I'm very sympathetic to them, that's not big enough, I think, to win you the debate. Look, coercive frameworks. The closing government's argument is that they solve this, and this is the magic bullet. They say we give you knowledge, and because we give you knowledge, right, that's an a priori good. Knowledge is always a good thing. There are a lot of things to note here. The first is that I think, like, if you want knowledge, North Koreans have knowledge of the outside world as well. We throw pamphlets at them. It's not clear to me why you can't similarly do this on that side of the house. But second, knowledge is literally the first thing out of the three things that this pill was going to do to you. Pertinently, what they don't actually give you is the ability to act on this knowledge in a way that is free. The reason why we value knowledge in the status quo is because it expands our conception of what options we have and therefore gives us more agency in the way we're going to deal with that. But they enforce a will on you, and they enforce a way in which you're going to react to this knowledge, make the value of this knowledge morally extremely dubious. The implication of which is that their outcome is uncertain in its value. But further to that, I also want to note that it is morally arbitrary why knowledge is the best outcome in the status quo. The reality is that the ways in which we conceptualize of the world are things that progress through time, and at random points in time, people come up with random ideas. It is false to say that the consent of everyone before those ideas existed is absolutely worthless. The implication of which is that I don't think they actually fulfill their burden of why knowledge is particularly important. Then they said there's no consent for that. Then they said that liberal democracy is the best solution, and the reason they gave for this is that liberal democracy don't judge your identity. I just don't think this is true. Look at, for example, the fact that liberal democracies have collectively decided to ban women from wearing the hijab in places like France and Switzerland, which in turn means that it's unclear that religious identity is fully protected there. But secondly, I want to note that your ability to conceptualize of a religious identity also depends on the structures and societies around you. If you believe that the structure of the society should be religious and that is ripped away from you, it's unclear why the agency is being protected on that side of the house. But further to that, I also want to note that against their claim that the problem is about relative inequality of like the moral worth of individuals. They do the exact same thing because liberal democracy denies value to individuals who happen to be lesser in number as a collective group, and therefore claims that what they believe the society should be is less important than other individuals, even though it is morally arbitrary that more or less people believe in that particular way of life. That's further to that. I also think that this inequality thing is just ridiculous because every morality is ultimately about how we want to prioritize the moral worth of individuals. A conscience would presumably believe that it is worth trading off other individuals who aren't suited by a non-utilitarian system, which in turn means that I think that core argumentation from Tin is pointless. What do we therefore give you? We told you that we aren't necessarily that coercive on the comparative, we probably protect agency. Note that no response is given to this in the closing government whip. The first thing that we tell you is that micro rebellion is possible, at least if insofar as your external agency is compromised. Within your mind, you are not. You are an individual with moral thoughts and ability to be dissatisfied at your condition. And insofar as it's ultimately our thoughts and our beliefs that make us different from each other, we are actually unique in being able to defend a world in which people retain individual agency at the end of the day. But secondly, at the point that they force a will onto individuals, and that is problematic, right? Because the reality is your conception of what freedom is differs significantly. But on that side of the house, you're never going to be able to opt out of a belief in that liberal democracy, even though the status quo in liberal democracies is one where people question that. They're not going to have that option, which means that at core, they're not going to achieve the highest level of agency on that side. At the end of the day, I think everything in the debate is ultimately going to be a marginal increase and decrease in consent. But the biggest problem is that when it comes to the one area that no one is ever able to repress, the area of thought, the area of like actually being able to make decisions of what you think the world should be. That's something that closing government never refutes, and that's an exclusive benefit that we will hold in closing opposition.
Okay, I'd like to thank the opposition whip for that fantastic speech. I'd like to thank everyone for an excellent debate. I believe we are adjudicating in this breakout room. Is that correct?
Yep.
Cool. So if everyone could vacate now, and yeah, see you later.
Thank you.